The next type of testing is widget testing. So widget testing tests that your UI looks and interacts how you want your UI to look and interact like. So in this maybe picture example, you see there's a toggle button here. You might want to test whether pressing it toggles it off and on. Now the way it works in Flutter is you have to first pump your widget onto a screen. So pump you could think of as loading a frame. That's the very first thing you should do. First, you should pump the widget that you're testing onto the screen so you could actually do something with it. Then let's say you want to tap it or do something else. You want to pump again to load the next frame after that tap. And then when you're actually done pumping, done doing all the actions you want to check for the results, you're going to need to use something called a finder. So the finder lets you go deep into the widget tree and find a specific thing you're looking for, whether it's using a key, whether it's using their tooltip or some other way to find that widget. There's multiple ways to find it. Then you find it and then you check if you find the right amount of that thing. So I think it'll be easier to see with an example. So here's a very simple example. Pretend you have a widget called My Widget and you pass it a title and a message and you just display those two strings there. So the very first thing you do is use this tester that's provided by Flutter. This is basically the thing that runs your widget tests. And like I said, you need to pump this widget onto the screen. So pump widget takes this widget, pumps it onto your screen, and not like your real screen. You're not going to see it on your desktop window. It's just kind of behind the scenes pumping it up so that you can actually do something and test with it. In this case, we're not doing any actions on this widget. We're going directly to the finders. So for this finders, you could find by different things. You could find by keys, you could find by text in this case, and this basically locates anything with the value with the text letter T. And at the end, you use the expect. Using your finders, it'll tell you how many things you found of it, and you want to make sure you only found one widget in this case. Now, other cases, you might have multiple, you might have none. There's different checkers for it, but in this case, you're only finding one. Now let's write some widget tests for our to-do application. What we're going to do is we're going to write 3 different tests. So the first one is going to check whether you start off with an empty to-do list. The second one, we're going to check whether this completed to-dos page, basically this completed to-dos widget, actually shows the widgets whenever you have a completed widget. And then lastly, we're going to test that when you drag this, you have a delete option, and that when you press the delete, it actually removes the to-dos. So let's get to these widget tests. For the widget test, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it widget tests. Again, it needs to be _test in order for it to be an actual test and for Flutter to pick it up and run it whenever you ask it to. We're going to need a main function within this widget test as well. Now let's first test the simplest thing, which is the empty array. So when we're empty, we have no to-dos. We're going to get this message saying add a to-do using the button below. We want to make sure that we see this message when we first start out the app and the to-do list should be empty. So define a widget test. If we go back to our unit test, you see all the tests started with a test keyword. For widget tests, it's similar, but it's test widgets instead. So for this one, we're going to have a description saying default state. And then the actual test we're going to write within here. When we had unit test, Flutter didn't provide anything within this test function, but with test widgets, we get a tester object. And we also want to make sure this is asynchronous, because our tests are going to have to wait for it to load after the taps and all of that. So the very first thing, we're going to take this tester and we're going to pump the widget we want to see. So the widget this time is just our whole application. So we're going to call the My App widget. And we want to await it, and then we can save it, and we'll actually run it. But this will bring up an error. And the error is that we don't have a provider scope defined. Our app needs a provider scope, so we can add that in. Now it should be able to run, and it'll pass because we're not checking anything. But we want to make sure we're actually checking that we can find this empty text here. So to check, we call the expect function. And same way, we have the actual result. And then we have a matcher. In this case, you want to find one widget. So you see you have options. You have find nothing, you have find one, or find multiple. In this case, we want to find one widget. And let me actually define the finder here first. So finder, we're going to call it default text. When we do it, find dot text. And in here, we're going to say add a to-do using the button below. And now we can check that we find it once. And we should run this test and see it pass successfully. Hopefully, as long as I didn't mistype something in here. Yes, it passes. So that's a very basic widget test to kind of give you the flow of how widget tests work. But let's get it a little bit more complicated. Let's test for that completed to-do that we were talking about. Record video, and let's add another one for the future, say edit video. So when we go to complete our to-do, this complete task should be checked in a unit test that it updates our data within our notifier, that the false becomes a true. And then what we want to check within the widget test is that this completed to-do widget actually shows that to-do in here. So I'll set up another test widgets. And this, we're going to say completed to-dos show up on completed page. And again, we want to make it asynchronous because we're going to want to await all this stuff. Now, while you're writing test widgets, you might run into some issues where your code doesn't really allow it to be tested easily. It's okay to change that code as long as it doesn't change performance. So in this case, we're going to add a completed to-do right away. So we want to add a feature or a way to kind of give the default values to our to-do list notifier. So we want our state to have the ability to pass in a default state. And do that. So this, whenever this thing is created, it assigns a state to the default state we pass in. And the default state has to be a type of to-do, and we want it to be a list. So normal operation, we're going to just initialize it with an empty list, just like we were doing before. Nothing really changes. Instead of using the super for an empty list, we're going to just define it directly so that we know it'll always be an empty list. So save it, and now we can actually override this and make it a little bit easier for us to test. So we're going to want our to-do list notifier to be defined with a default state here. It's going to be a type of to-do, and we're going to add one item in here. And it's a to-do item with an ID of 0. Content will say record video, and completed, we're going to say true. So we want to just start off our test with this state just to make it easier so we don't have to go through the whole process of adding and removing and all that stuff. And we're going to pump a very similar widget as we did here. So we still need the provider scope, but now instead of the whole application, we actually just want to load in this completed to-do screen. Since these are widget tests, we're not testing the whole app. We're just testing one widget, and that widget is this whole screen. Now, in order to get this correct state with this completed being true, we're going to actually need to override the default provider. And you do that within the provider scope by defining some overrides. So I'm going to take the to-do provider that we normally have, and we're going to override it with the notifier that we defined up there. All right, so let's walk through what we did here. So very similar like we did before, we pumped this new widget, this time the completed to-do widget instead of the whole My App. So we pumped this widget onto the screen, but we did it with a default value that we set ourselves so that we do get something that shows up here. And we overrode the provider that we normally have with this default value. Now the only thing left is to actually check that this text showed up within this widget. And we do it the same way we did before using the Finder. And we can call this completed text. And the text should be record video, since that's the default one we put in. If we save it, we run it, we have a problem. I found the error. So because we didn't run the whole application, there's no material app defined within our provider scope or completed to do. It's just the state and goes directly to that widget. But we want to wrap this in a widget called material app. so that there's some definition of what an app is for this test. Okay, now we should be able to run it, and hopefully this time it will pass. There we go. So our last test we're going to do is that we can slide this widget and actually delete it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to copy this widget because a lot of it is similar, and then we're going to add in a couple more things. So for this one, we want to be able to slide and delete a to-do. Slide and delete a to-do. I want it to start off with not being completed because we want it to show up on the home screen. So the thing we want to test here is the home page, because our not finished to-dos are on the home page. Now we're going to load in a record video to-do that's already there, and it should be able to find it just like it was up here, but now this time on the home page since the completed was false. Now I can run the test just to make sure that is true, whatever I said, and it is. And now we can act a little bit more upon it. So in order to find this slidable widget and this delete button, I'm going to assign a key to them within our application. We're going to go to the home screen. We're going to find the slidable widget. Now the key I'm going to give the slidable widget, you can give it any key you want, but for me it's going to be a value key, and the value I'm going to give it is the to-dos at that index. I'm going to take the to-do ID and turn it into a string. So basically, the value key for this is going to be the to-do ID in string format. And then for the delete option, which will be this slidable action button, because this is the one that would actually delete it, I'm going to give it a key of the same thing plus delete. So those are the two keys we're going to need for this. Now we go back to the test and we can use those. So first thing we want to do is we need to drag this. We do that by calling the tester and do a timed drag. And maybe let me define those two finders first. So finder will be the draggable widget. We do find by key. And the key for this one is just going to be 0 because it's at index 0. And it needs to be a value key. The draggable widget and then the actual delete button will be a value key of 0 and delete. Okay, so finder, we're going to be dragging the draggable widget. We're going to have an offset of 200. That means we're going to drag it this way for 200 pixels. And the Y direction, we're not going to drag it anywhere. And then duration, I'm going to do seconds 1. Okay, then we do await tester.pump because we want it to load that action. We want that to happen. We want the frames to load so that we can actually see and get to the next part of this test. The next part of this is we want to await tester and click tap. So we want to tap on that delete button. And we already have it defined, so we call it delete button. It gets tapped. We want to make sure we pump again so that the frame gets loaded. And now we should be able to check that we see this initial text because there's no more to-dos left. So we have the default text, and we want to expect to find that default text on our screen. Okay, so those are the 3 widget tests. And let's see if they all work. We can run all of them. If we get 3 check marks, we know we are good. And there we go. So that's widget testing. We're able to test that the completed to-dos page shows all the completed to-dos, that we're able to drag and click this delete button, and then if there's no to-dos, that we get the text widget showing up.